Hello again. Today I am here with my August wrap-up, and this is the horror thriller wrap-up, if this shirt hasn't tipped you off already. So I've read these physical books and the two ebooks that I have listed on the screen. Let's just start with the ebooks. First one I'm going to talk about is Disappearance at Devil's Rock. This was my first Paul Tremblay book I read. I really did enjoy this book. Not a great book, but a very good book. I would definitely give it at least a 3.5, maybe 3.75. I did really enjoy it, but it did drag in some spots. It's more of a ghost story and mystery type of story. It is creepy and it does involve kids, so that's always a cool horror book to read. And I really did like seeing the mystery kind of unfold about these kids who basically know more than they're letting on. And what happens is this one child disappears and suddenly diary entries start showing up at their parents' house. You start wondering where these entries came from. Did the child actually do these entries? What happened to the child? What's wrong with the child? And again, you find out little bits and pieces about the story. So it kind of does a lot of flashbacks, finding out what actually happened to this child. And it is a pretty creepy book. Like I said, it was a little weak in some spots, so I wouldn't give it a 4-star, but I still did really enjoy it. And I am looking forward to reading more Paul Tremblay in the future based on that book. The next book I read on ebook was Demon King. Now this has been hyped a lot on Kindle. I see it on BookBub, where I get all the cheap ebooks advertised all the time. It's a book free on Kindle Unlimited if you have Kindle Unlimited. A lot of people talk about comparing this to It, because again, it does deal with kids who had to deal with something, a horrible thing, and then as an adult has to deal with it as well. What I really liked about it, besides going in the past and the present, is it also had a lot of feeling of how a town basically gets abandoned, how a town in decline you get to see, and you know it's all connected to this past event. Again, just like the other book, it does go back a lot more in this book, back and forth between 2007, I believe, and in the late 70s, early 80s. And again, it's a really good book. I really did enjoy it. I thought it was very well done. I don't want to get too much into it, but if you are a fan of It and Stephen King, you probably will really enjoyed this book. I also liked how it kind of left it open for a sequel. Definitely the ending of the book, not that I'm going to spoil it, but the ending of the book definitely left it open for a sequel. So I am kind of interested to see where it goes from here. It is a pretty large book, but again, just a very enjoyable book, and that is Demon King. Now let's get to the actual physical books that I've read. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Eternal Frankenstein. This book was in my Nocturnal Readers box, and I finally got to read it. I am not a huge fan of short story collections usually. This had a few good ones that I did really enjoy. On the whole, again, I just didn't like a lot of them. Especially, I believe it was the last one, Mary Shelley's Body, it's called. And I really didn't like the way they kind of used Mary Shelley as a plot device in that story. And I just actually didn't like that story at all. I felt it was a little hard to actually go into a person who lives over 100 years now and try to actually give her a voice in a book. I felt like it was kind of hollow and a gimmick, and I actually didn't like that story at all. Most of the other stories were okay. Again, there were some ones I did enjoy, but most of them I actually just did not like that much, and I probably wouldn't recommend this as a short story collection. It just wasn't one that I got into, and I would give it maybe a 2.5 stars. I just felt like, yeah, there were a couple of good stories in here, but as a full collection, I didn't really like it, and I really disliked the last story. So yeah, that's my review for Eternal Frankenstein. Next one I'm going to talk about is actually Frankenstein. I've read the 1818 version of Frankenstein, and I was curious to read this one and to see the differences. And there are differences between this and the 1818 version. While Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is classic horror literature, and this is actually the version of Frankenstein that most people read is the 1831 version, which is a more updated, more fleshed out version, I guess, of the Frankenstein story that Mary Shelley originally wrote anonymously in 1818. This I don't like as much as the 1818 version. And I'll say that I don't remember all of the different changes that were made to the story. If you read the introduction, they say that the changes were pretty much mostly in the beginning of this story. But I felt like if you could read one version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and you have not read the 1818 version, I would highly recommend reading the 1818 version instead of this one. Not because I didn't like this one, but I feel like the changes that they made to this version just didn't make the story as personal to me. The monster in this story is not as personal as he was in the 1818 version. I also believe that the scene with the blind man in this book and in the 1818 version, I like the 1818 version better. For some reason, I don't remember electricity being a part of the 1818 version, and I believe it is a part of this book from what I remember. And I liked the 1818 version better. And I was glad that I read that before I read this, so it didn't color my opinion of the book as much. If I read this first and then I read the 1818 version, I might have had a different opinion. But I actually really like the shorter, more concise, more personal relationship between Frankenstein and the monster that I felt was in the 1818 version. I felt way more connection to the monster in the 1818 version than I did in this version. So again, while I'm comparing Frankensteins now, comparing the 1818 and this one, I'm not going to give it as high a rating as the 1818 version. I think the 1818 version is better. And sadly enough, most people are reading this version instead of the other one. That's my opinion of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, I just talked about Eternal Frankenstein, saying that I don't like short story collections that much. And now I'm going to tell you of a short story collection I actually did really enjoy. And that is the year's best hardcore horror, Volume 3. I haven't read Volume 1 or Volume 2 of this series, but this has some really interesting stories. I really like some of these stories. Some of these stories are actually like 5-star stories. They are just great. And they're horror, and they're humor, and they're dark, really dark, some of them. There's one story called Junk, which is about a man who basically goes on webcams and on chat sites, chat boards, and shows his junk to people when he tries to start a conversation. Basically what happens to this person is very dark when he gets to wind up being the victim of somebody showing him a dick pic. So that gives you the idea of how these stories go, how a little bit more extreme some of these stories are. That was a really good story. Tree Huggers was another story about some people who tie themselves to a tree, environmentalist type of story. Again, a very dark story that was really good. One of the best stories in this collection, and to me, the story, if you're going to buy this collection, the one story you should buy this for is called Foreign Bodies. And I'm not going to get in too deep to what the story is, but it literally had me cracking up especially at the end of the story. It's basically about a person who was like a children's celebrity personality who winds up getting into a controversy because he goes through a scanner and you find out that he had this watch in his butt, and of course, that watch was connected to a hooker. And so he winds up, losing all his fortune from his fame from this children's TV show he used to do. Obviously cannot be doing that anymore. And he talks about making a comeback in this story and calls a fixer to help him remove something that's in his butt. It's hard to even explain these stories, but it goes into such a dark, not even dark, it goes into such a weird storyline, and the ending is just, you read the ending, and if you're not laughing at that ending, I don't know what's wrong with you, because that ending just cracked me up. It was, again, these stories are dark. There's stories about snuff films, there's stories that deal with some torture. There are some definitely not PC stories in this collection. But if you like your horror dark and you like to try a little bit of the twisted stuff, I would highly recommend this year's best hardcore horror Volume 3. I really did enjoy it. And that's enough about that one. Next book I'm going to talk about is Dawn and Damnation This is a Western, I guess I would call it a horror story. It almost kind of borders on urban fantasy in a way. It deals with all of these people who go to this world damnation, which is kind of like a purgatory. If they get killed in damnation, they wind up going to hell. And, it's an old West town, so there are gunfights, but there are werewolves and vampires and darker creatures in this world, along with all of the people who killed people and all of the gunslingers from the Old West in here. And what happens is a woman comes in and you find out that she's pregnant, and it's dealing with that and dealing with the warring factions trying to basically get this woman and the person protecting this woman. And it's a good story, and I really did enjoy it, and I look forward to the next one. Not a perfect story by any means, but a pretty solid story. Again, I'm not going to give it, I'll give it a 3.75 again, because I think it's halfway decent, but it does lag in some spots, and it kind of skirts the line in my mind from urban fantasy to horror in a way, because it's not as scary, but it's a pretty interesting story, and that is Dawn in Damnation. Next one I'm going to talk about is Slade House. The story starts off with this woman and her child who go to this house, and the kids start seeing some weird things going on in the house. And then you find out that these two people who are in the house basically use the house to lure people in, and kind of, I don't want to get into it too much, I don't want to spoil it. But it takes place over multiple years and decades. A story about basically these two people who are trapping these people who are coming into this house and tricking them, basically, in this house, and how someone could stop this from happening. Again, I want to try to be somewhat as vague as I can in this story, because I think this is a story that's better to know a lot less going into it. I did enjoy this. Again, this is a 4-star read. I actually did enjoy this story. I thought it was interesting, different, while, again, not a perfect 5-star read. It definitely was something that I did really enjoy, and that is Slade House. Next one I'm going to talk about is Dean Koontz's Velocity. I read this for Cammy's Corner's Harrowing Horror last month, and I actually kind of liked it. I don't think she was as big a fan of it as probably I was, but I really actually did enjoy this story. It starts off with a person who gets a letter basically saying, if you go to the cops, this one person's going to die, and if you don't go to the cops, this other person's going to die. Basically making them have the decision of, well, will this person die or that person die? It's your decision. And it keeps going from there, how this killer torments this person, and then this person winds up doing more and more stuff. And it's a pretty nice thriller. I actually thought it was a pretty well done, well paced thriller. I really did enjoy it. I'm going to give it a 4-star. I thought it had a lot of twists and turns, was really interesting, never bored me. I actually read this book in like a day and a half, because I marathon read it on one of my days off, because I really did enjoy the story, and I thought it was very well done. So that is Velocity by Dean Koontz. And the last book I'm going to talk about is The Narrows by Ronald Malfi. The only other Ronald Malfi book I've read before this was his short story collection, which I loved. And like I said, I usually don't like short story collections. So when I totally was in love with his short story collection, I said, I gotta buy more books from this guy. So The Narrows is the first one I read. And this story is kind of weird. Again, it deals with children. Or deals with a child, basically. And it kind of is a vampire story. At least that's what they say. But I didn't really consider the creature that you see in this. Again, I want to be vague. The creature that you see in this is not what you would consider a vampire. In fact, it kind of feels more like a ghoul or a zombie in my mind. It does have some interesting ways that it kills the victims it kills. And it does deal with children in this, or a child in this. So it does have, again, like Disappearance at Devil's Rock and like Demon King, has that nice element of, child in danger. But I did really enjoy this book. Again, this is another 4-star read. I thought it was a great book. I look forward to reading more Ronald Malfi and seeing what I like about his other books. But again, I really liked this book. I thought it was a great book. Definitely a interesting twist ending too. that I did not see coming, and I really liked it. I liked the ending of this book a lot. Again, a 4-star read. I highly recommend it. That is The Narrows by Ronald Malfi. And that is my horror August wrap-up. Thanks again for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video if you like it. And I will see you soon. Goodbye.